Once you've done the background reading or background research, you've seen what's already out there, what questions have been asked and answered, and what strategies seem to be most effective. It's time to start thinking about how well those findings can be applied to your students. Um, Earlier, I mentioned that when I first started doing research, I hoped that my question was a question that no one had asked before because I didn't think I could come up with another question. I was so proud of the question I'd come up with. I hoped that no one had asked it before, so it could be mine. Um, but now I realize that if someone has already asked the same question and answered it, that doesn't mean it was asked well enough for me or well enough for my participants, or in this case, probably students. I teach at a historically black university, so most research in the United States is done at primarily white universities because of just the demographic breakdown of people who go to college. So if I find a study about the topic that I'm interested in, chances are it hasn't been asked at an HBCU in the rural South. And that by itself is a unique demographic. That's good if I want to ask a new question, but it's bad if I want to benefit from the research that's already been done. So I have to ask myself, for example, the topic of motivation and student attendance. Is the literature that's out there, the findings that have already been gained, do those apply to my students? And if so, how can I be confident that the unique demographics of my students applies to whatever demographics or relates to whatever demographics are um, are in the study that was conducted previously? So, for example, my students tend to be on the poorer end of the socioeconomic spectrum. Um, some of them come from urban environments such as Atlanta and Miami are two popular locations. Um, and then a lot of students are from the rural South. So they live in small communities, farming communities, with uh, schools like public schools with low academic preparation values. And so these are all just some of the demographical details about my students. If I'm reading a study about chronic absenteeism at like a private school in New England, I can't expect the results to translate directly to my students, but it might be a place to start. So maybe the design that was used in New England can be a design that I use, keeping in mind that my students are different. So perhaps my questions will be slightly different, the kind of data I collect will be slightly different, maybe what I expect to find will be slightly different. So you have to think seriously about your students and what you know about them personally, so what you've learned experiencing or what you've learned interacting with them, but also what you know generally about the demographics your students represent. There's a lot of literature out there about student demographics and academic achievement, for example. So you can look at things like race, ethnicity, poverty status, even region, family status. So, like what sort of family they're coming from. Um, Possibly religion, I'm not sure exactly, access to healthcare, access to quality nutrition, and maybe previous education. You could look at local public school achievement rates or any sort of data that has been collected or analyzed. There are a lot of areas to look at with a lot of research around them to help you better understand your students. But don't just assume that if something worked at one school, it's going to work at your school too. And in fact, the best research will consider the possibility that your students are so unique that you can't directly translate any findings from another study into yours. So start to think about not just that your students are different and nothing will apply, but how are they different and how will those results change when they apply to you? So I really feel like every researcher should think seriously, or excuse me, every applied researcher, so taking existing knowledge and applying it in a unique case or in in this instance, teaching. So taking teaching research and applying it to a teaching practice in your classroom. Think about how the results will differ based on the unique demographic of your students and perhaps like the materials you have available to you. That will, A, it'll strengthen your research and your practice, and B, it will accept and appreciate the differences that exist um, between your students and perhaps the rest of the world, or just these other samples that have been collected. And you'll find that your perspective of your students deepens and your appreciation for what makes them different deepens. What I'm trying to say is what it takes for you to be an excellent teacher at your school will probably differ from what it takes for you to be an excellent teacher at a different school, or specifically a school with widely different demographics of students. The term for research findings at one school applying to another school is called generalization. So when I studied first generation college students' experiences at my HBCU, if that finding, so the finding was that there's a period of transformation that first generation college students go through, the ones that succeed go through, and that's recognizing that college is useful to those students for achieving their goals. Before that transition, students feel like college is a hurdle to navigate and they're not sure if they can do it. But once students realize that, oh no, forget the hurdle, I want to go I want to be a teacher. And the only way I can be a teacher is to pass these classes. And passing those classes will make me a better teacher. So they're focused not on college, but on the goal that comes next. And then college helps them facilitate that goal. And so I suspect that that is not unique to first generation college students at HBCUs. I suspect it generalizes to primarily white institutions or private institutions or for-profit institutions, although there would be slight differences in how that process occurs or how it unfolds. So that would have to be, the study would have to be repeated at those other institutions because the generalizability wouldn't be perfect. It would be close, and I think you could learn enough from my study to predict what would happen at these other schools, but you'd have to actually conduct it there. And so that's generalizability. Um, so if you find that you want to improve student motivation for learning math, and you found this other teacher who had success with an activity, and so you apply that activity to your students, hoping to find the same response. If your students respond the same way, then that finding was generalizable to your classroom. But you can't assume that it always will be. This is so the I think this is the last the last one here. Every research question that's asked or the hypothesis for what will happen is based on a theory. So for example, a learning theory is a system that explains how learning occurs and what sort of maybe brain structures or neurological structures or behavioral structures or properties or even personality traits that are involved in the learning process. So, in the behavioral learning theory, the assumption is that the only thing that matters is what can be observed. So, right now I'm talking and like gesticulating with my hand. These are observable behaviors. You can teach me increasingly sophisticated behaviors, such as how to use my smartphone as a camera and this like individual microphone in order to record these little lectures and then upload them on YouTube. And so that would be a more sophisticated behavior than just simply learning how to speak. But the learning theory of behaviorism goes all the way back to like John Watson and B.F. Skinner. And it's this assumption that we're all born blank slates. So we're born completely neutral. And anything that we can do, such as make YouTube videos, has been learned through this process of operant conditioning for Skinner, for Watson, classical conditioning. Um, so if I were to design a behavior modification strategy to improve student behavior in my classrooms, then I would probably be borrowing from this behavioral learning theory, which explains how all behaviors are learned. But maybe your new teaching strategy comes from the field of motivation psychology or cognitive psychology. In other words, there's a reason behind why an effective strategy works, and that explanation is going to come from a theory. Now, I don't know that it's entirely necessary to understand the theory, but it tends to show up in every research article that I read, and I know it's at play whenever I am trying to understand why a solution will work. But I think if you're just getting started, if you have no idea why the problem student is a problem student, or why people just aren't doing their homework or paying attention or falling asleep, and you'll just try anything, I think it would be okay to try an activity just to see if it'll work. Um, just know that there's a rationale behind why the activity was designed in the first place, and it wasn't just someone randomly trying to use some new tool or some new technique. It wasn't some random guess. It was based on a justification. That justification comes from a theory. So I guess that's advanced. Um, I challenge you to try to read up on the theoretical foundation of whatever solution you're looking for. And that's it. That's it from this section.